Hello, and welcome to the last session of our strategy class. As you know, this week you had three chapters, the one that talked about international strategies, the one that looked at structural issues, and the one that looked at current trends. I was thinking pretty hard about what to present today, and I've decided to focus my presentation on the internationalization issues. I will talk about some stuff that your chapter covers, but also I would introduce certain concepts that are not covered in depth in your textbook. And then for the remaining two chapters, chapter 14 on structural issues, I suggest you just read it carefully yourself. And chapter 16 that talks about current trends, uh, don't really worry too much about that. As you have seen in the past few years, well, this 2020 year specifically, there has been a lot more changes than we could have anticipated. So just browse it through, but don't really sweat too much about it. So let me pull up my slides. And in terms of lecture highlights, I'll talk about internationalization, what it really is, and why companies are doing that. So the reasons and the benefits that they expect to derive from it, some of the key aspects, the two elements that all firms must consider when they develop their international strategies. And then I will focus on three specific strategies that firms might consider. We'll talk about what it means for them, why some firms choose certain strategies while others choose something else. And then we'll proceed to talking about entry modes. Right, when you enter international economies, there are definitely different opportunities for you to do that. You may simply export your stuff. You may open up like your own facility in a third country, and there's everything in between. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of using each of these strategies and entry modes. And then I will transition to something that the textbook does not really talk about, managing across borders, right? How exactly you structure your company, who do you put in charge when you open up a branch overseas, how do you deal with some of the issues? And I'll also talk about how you protect yourself from international competition, right? So for the most part, when you read your textbook, it talks about US companies or Western companies going overseas and the options and choices they have available. There is this other dimension to internationalization. It's when companies from lesser developed countries enter the US market, and they typically enter as low cost competitors, which definitely has implications. And there are some strategic responses you can employ to protect your business and remain profitable. So I'll talk about that. And I will conclude the lecture with discussing four postures of multinational enterprises in the global arena. So this is really more, I guess, strategic thinking, forward thinking. How much do you want to exploit the opportunities you see, as opposed to how much you want to develop those markets to be able to benefit from them in the long term. So there are pros and cons again for different postures, and I will focus on them and discuss why you want to do certain things and not others. So, but let me start with the definitional issues and basically what is international strategy. You remember that here we talk about the scope of the firm, right? So this is one of the areas that falls under the corporate level strategies when you manage the scope of your company. And traditionally, when we looked at international strategies, we primarily talked about strategies through which the firm would sell its goods and services outside the domestic markets. Now, the challenge with this definition is that right now it's pretty hard to say what the domestic market is, especially if you're an internet-based company. Your clients may come from everywhere, right? So what constitutes domestic is no longer clear, So our notion of international strategies have changed as well. So now when we talk about international strategy, we primarily talk about the strategy that defines how the firm organizes its operations across multiple countries to reach sustainable competitive advantage. So again, there is this focus on sustainable competitive advantage or ensuring above average returns over the long run, right? So that's what we mean. And we'll start with the reasons for internationalization. So, why do firms go global to begin with? A very simple reason is sometimes you do that to access the resources. It could be that, if you happen to be in one of the industries where the US does not offer fantastic resources, you have to go global. If you're a coffee company, yeah, sure, you can source some of your coffee from Hawaii, but primarily it's grown elsewhere. So you have to be present in those countries, regardless of whether you own any coffee growing facilities or just source from there. You have to be present. If you're an oil refinery, if your goal is to extract oil, obviously you have to go to where oil reserves will be. If you're in the textile industry, you probably go to where there's cheap labor, right? You can source labor anywhere, but there are only certain countries where labor is cheap enough to make this activity economically viable and sustainable. So you have to go there simply to access the resources. So that's kind of a pull factor into internationalization, not necessarily push. The other reason is, sometimes there are great opportunities out there. The picture you see here, this is from 1990, the first McDonald's ever opening in the Soviet Union, Moscow. I do remember that day. I did not live in Moscow, but I've seen this on TV. People would stand like 3, 4 hours in a waiting line just to try the Big Mac. And the prices they were paying for a meal would roughly be equivalent to their daily wages. Yet you can see how enthusiastic the people were. So, if you're a company that faces this kind of enthusiastic demand overseas, you don't want to leave the money on the table. You definitely want to expand there and serve the market and generate all the cash that you can, right? So that's a pretty good reason to diversify globally. You may also lack room for growth domestically. For companies like Starbucks, you can find them literally every corner of every street in the United States. So if they want to grow, they have two opportunities. One is diversification, and this is why they do in the teas and whatnot, and food items. But also there is this huge untapped market globally where they can simply replicate their business models and exploit the opportunities that are readily available. You guys have written a report on Jewel, and many of you said that international opportunities are attractive enough for it to consider going overseas. Again, you don't want to leave the money on the table, but also, when your growth prospects are limited in the domestic market, you have to look outside, right? You have to go after those opportunities and try to establish some healthy, decent relationship with customers overseas. And finally, this is something that is rarely talked about. Internationalization gives you an opportunity to extend the product lifecycle. So I have two pictures here of two virtually identical cars. The one on the left is Fiat 124, made in Italy in 1966. The one on the right is a virtually identical car. Sure, the shape of your headlights is slightly different, and the mirrors have moved somewhat, right? Those side mirrors. But otherwise, it's the same basic car called Lada, made in Russia back in 2012. So then, for a company like Fiat, they're able to exploit something that they have invested decades ago for many years. You think about Volkswagen and Volkswagen Beetle, right? You all know that car, and it was designed initially in Germany in 1930s. And when the car became obsolete over there, what they did is they simply shipped manufacturing equipment to Latin American countries, and they were manufacturing those same basic cars up until 2015, I want to say, in Brazil. So that definitely gives you an opportunity to generate some cash based on your old investments over and over, right? So that's a fairly decent reason to consider internationalization as well. And obviously, it brings along a number of benefits. It allows you to exploit location advantages, things like cheap labor, energy, land, or maybe if your business is sort of ecologically unfriendly, you go to the place where ecological regulations are not as tight. Now, we may be questioning the ethics of such decisions, but from the business standpoint, if you can save on costs, you either share the benefits with your customers, you appropriate all this extra money for yourself, for your shareholders, which is consistent with how many businesses want to be run. You also get the benefit of increased market size. And for many US incumbents that have already established their presence here, that's the primary way to grow, right? That's where the rest of the market is. They cannot grow in the States. So that's that. For many businesses, they need this huge market to justify investments in research and development. If you think about consumer electronics, there are just few places around the world where they make TV screens because the investments you need to make are only justifiable if you have hundreds of millions potential customers, and that's that. Think about aircraft manufacturing. There are just three major players: Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer of Brazil. So again, they are global because the investments in research and development are such that they need this huge market to make it work. And then finally, businesses internationalize because of economies of scale and learning. Right, so the more you grow, we kind of talked about that when we discussed cost leadership strategy. You double your output, your cost per unit of production goes down 20 to 30%. So with standardization comes those economies of scale and economies of learning. And it's not true just for manufacturing. Even in services, now you see more and more of that. So, things like tax preparation, they now outsource to countries like India. If you ever called your bank in some crazy hours, chances are you're going to be connected to the person who sits halfway around the world and still is able to guide you through whatever issues you're facing. Sometimes it works wonderfully. Other times, when I call my bank, then between my accent and that person's accent, sometimes half the communication is lost in translation. But definitely the businesses stand to gain tremendously from leveraging the global workforce and standardization, even in things like services. And so, what are the key issues they need to address when they start globalizing? It turns out there are really just two aspects that they need to think through very carefully. Aspect number one is global integration. Right? So to have those economies of scale, economies of learning, to have this greater market, you've got to integrate everything globally. You have to serve the market as if it's truly homogeneous, right? So you do not necessarily tailor your products or tailor your services to each specific market you serve. This way, through standardization, you can expect to see those benefits associated with economies of scale. At the same time, because the world really isn't that homogeneous and people preferences differ substantially, you have to be locally responsive. And so these two forces, global integration and local responsiveness, are really like yin and yang of global strategy. And the way that companies approach balancing these two differs quite substantially. So the first way to balance those forces is to really emphasize local responsiveness. In this way, whenever you open a new facility in a different country, you try to make sure that it is sort of tailor made to the tastes of the people who live in that country. So, this kind of strategy we call multi-domestic strategy because, in a sense, in every country that you go to, you treat it as as a domestic business. You treat those people differently from the way you treat people at your home country and from the way you would treat your customers in some other country you would go to. So obviously the benefits of integration here are not that huge, but because you are locally responsive, people see you as a legitimate company. They appreciate your business and they respond well to your attempts to serve their unique needs. Um, many companies follow the strategy. I'm giving you here an example of a company called Nestle. You probably have heard about this company, and I'm pretty sure you know some of the products they manufacture and market. So definitely Kit Kat. Yeah, you know that. Maybe that cat chow. I don't know. I do have a cat, but I rarely buy the food, so it's usually my wife. But I know that I've seen these other brands offered by Nestle in other countries, but not in the United States, right? So they try to have a unique offering for each of the markets where they operate, believing that this local responsiveness will be met well by the customers. At the other extreme, we have the global strategy, right? So this is a strategy that emphasizes global integration over local responsiveness. Here you treat the world as if everybody is the same, as if none of the responsiveness is required. An iPhone you buy in Russia is the same iPhone you're going to get in the United States or Australia. So you simply treat the world as if it's fully homogeneous and you globally integrate all the operations, trying to get those economies of scales and learning and bigger market that would justify your R&D investments. And there are many companies that follow this strategy. So here I'm giving you the example of Sony. Like this store, there's no way to know where this photo was taken, right? It could be in the States, it could be in Japan, could literally be anywhere. So these companies do not really customize the products at all, maybe with the exception of the voltage, because elsewhere in the world, most countries have 220 volts as opposed to 110 in the United States. But even that now is kind of standardized, and you can have the same unit that you can plug into power outlet anywhere in the world without burning your product or forcing it to explode. So that's sort of the other extreme. And then finally, what we have is we have some companies trying to balance these two dimensions, local responsiveness and global integration. Companies that do that are sent to pursue a transnational strategy, and it is easier said than done because those forces are, they are in conflict, and it's very hard to globally integrate some aspects of your operations while allowing some local responsiveness in other parts of the value chain or other parts of the business. There are some companies that appear to have done that successfully. I'm giving you here the example of McDonald's offerings in, I actually think it's from Austria, but maybe it's Germany. So you see that they serve your standard burger, although it's called McRib, so maybe that is non-standard either, along with beer, right? So the company tries to use its know-how and its business models, the standardization and whatnot, while still acknowledging the demands of the local culture. If this is what customers need to see offered uh, in their fast food restaurants, McDonald's respects that, and it customizes its offerings somewhat while still maintaining a lot of standardized practices that allow it to achieve the kind of efficiency and effectiveness it is known for. So this week, you guys are looking at KFC expansion into Japan. That's an older case. I believe it comes from 1970s. But I definitely will encourage you to think about the degree to which the company tried to pursue both global integration and local responsiveness and the kind of solution that emerged. So again, transnational strategies are pretty hard to implement because those forces that drive them kind of pull the company into opposite directions. But if you manage to do that successfully, there are definitely benefits to be enjoyed, and companies that do that well seem to have this above average performance compared to rivals. And so, if we combine these two dimensions into one simple two by two plot, again, as I said, we try to make everything simple in strategy. We have three options that companies are considering: the multi-domestic, global, and transnational. Please notice that there is nothing in this left bottom uh, quadrant of this figure when you do not really customize your products and you do not also pursue global integration. There are some companies that are said to follow this strategy as well, and some authors would simply call it the international model. So, notably, there are um, traditional wine manufacturers in France who believe that the product is good enough and does not need customization, and they do not really try to globally integrate their operations to seek any economies of scale or location advantages or anything like that. They simply sell it, they simply export it, and that's that. So those kind of companies would fall into this missing segment in this figure. But because it's not really much of a strategy, it's kind of a reactive response. We don't usually talk much about it when discussing strategy. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that to a significant extent, the strategy you will be implementing will be dictated by your industry. So, industry is extremely important, and we've talked about that previously when we looked at the five forces of competition framework. So, the idea there is that the way those forces are aligned suggests certain key success factors that you need to address if you want to be successful in the industry. So globally, there are some industries that necessitate that scale, which kind of pushes your company towards the global strategy. And there are other industries that thrive on being locally responsive, on offering some, local diversity and variety, and those would kind of suggest a multi-domestic strategy. But oftentimes, what you see is even within the same industries. So if you look at electronics, companies pursue very, very different strategies. So Philips, the European company, seems to be pursuing a multi-domestic international expansion, whereas companies like Sony or Matsushita would be much better aligned with the global strategy. And the reason behind it is unique historical conditions. So when Philips was created, that would be like late 19th century, maybe early 20th century, the world was not globalized. Every country was very protective of its borders. If you wanted to exploit that market in a third country, you had to establish presence there. You had to effectively create a new domestic company in the third country, which naturally led to your company pursuing a multi-domestic strategy. If you started globalizing in the 1970s, the world was a lot more unified at that point. So that naturally suggested that you want to pursue benefits that global strategy can provide you. And this is why companies like Sony would be seen better aligned with this global element of the international strategy. So, despite all the talk we can talk, the benefits of this and benefits of that, sometimes history matters so much that you can actually see its impact on everything that company does strategically, organizationally, and otherwise. Now, if you decided to go overseas, if you decided to expand internationally, how exactly are you going to do that? And in terms of entry modes, you actually have a great number of choices. It may start simply with exporting. It's definitely scale efficient because all your manufacturing will be focused in just one place, so you would get those economies of scale. But depending on what the nature of your product is, you could be subject to high transportation costs and tariff barriers. So, it's one thing if you produce maybe, some medical pills, drugs. Those are inexpensive to ship. They weigh very little. The package is usually not that huge. So that's not an issue. If you manufacture in something that's bulky, it's definitely going to add a lot of cost to your operations. One of the reasons why IKEA is so efficient, right, it sources product from everywhere, is the flat packaging design it has come up with. It can ship a lot in small containers, and because of that, the relative cost of that shipping is kind of minimal. So, unless you can do something like that, exporting may not be the best option in the long run. You can always start exporting, but at some point you probably will want to consider other alternatives. What other alternatives are there? You can look at licensing, right? You can possibly license your production, your manufacturing, maybe even your services to a trusted partner in a third country. So, in this sense, your risks and your commitment is kind of low. You do not invest your own resources. The big problem is you can possibly lose control over your proprietary designs or technology or whatever it is that you license. Company Abercrombie and Fitch. They design the products in the United States and then they license the manufacturing to certain companies in Southeast Asia. So not so long ago, they have actually found themselves in quite a pickle. I believe they ordered the production of 2,000 pair of jeans to a country in Southeast Asia. Unknown to them, that company has manufactured 20,000 pairs of the same jeans. And, it flooded the market with those illegally manufactured copies. And, that's an issue. You may try to address some of these concerns through franchising. This is where you have this designated third party who, again, you sort of teach everything how to run a business. You provide a lot of marketing support and business model, operations practices, and whatnot. Again, it's low risk for you. The costs are low as well. Here, your main concern is loss of control over quality. So you remember earlier today, I showed you that picture of McDonald's, first place opened in the Soviet Union. One of the things that went into opening of that first location was establishment of its own farms, like meat farms, by McDonald's in Russia. Apparently, the quality of meat was such a big deal for them, they chose not to trust local farmers and they establish those farms themselves to ensure that the meat is exactly to their specifications, so that, if poor quality issues arise, it would not necessarily affect the global reputation of the company negatively, right? Because if you run into a poor quality product uh, sold under McDonald's brand somewhere in a third country, and it makes the news, it's going to affect the entire franchise system, right? So you want to be very mindful of that. You may try to enter other countries through strategic alliances, and we talked about that previously, so I will not necessarily go into details here. Joint venture, obviously, is always an option. So here you create a third entity together with a local partner. So you have the local expertise, you have your own global expertise that you bring to the table, you share risks and costs. uh, the problem is, there's a conflict between the parties. Everyone is holding some equity stake in a joint venture. It's a lot harder to get those reconciled. You cannot really force your opinion on a partner. You have to come to terms somehow peacefully, and sometimes it's not necessarily as easy. You may enter a country through acquisition, just acquire a company that operates in the same industry and, retool, restructure, redevelop. This tends to be expensive. This is often financed through debt. So, there's interest to be paid and whatnot. And often the legal issues are very complex. So you want to avoid that as much as possible unless you really know what you're doing. And then finally, there's greenfielding. That's the entry mode that is most expensive. So this is when you build a new wholly owned subsidiary. You get full control. So all of those issues we discussed previously are nullified, but the costs are really high, and so are the risks if it doesn't work out the way you hope. So those are the basic entry modes that you have to be mindful of. Now, whichever way you enter, how do you manage across borders? If you open a branch in a different country, now obviously you're going to have some expatriates, people who go there from your country to represent your values. Obviously, you're going to have some local employees who will be, who are probably the reason why you go there in the first place. But how exactly are you going to manage that business? It turns out that countries are very different in terms of their cultures. There are several dimensions that are especially salient when it comes to differentiating between cultural values. Uh, Things like power distance, individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, and masculinity versus femininity, which is probably better referred to as quantity of life versus quality of life. So if you are a U.S. manager and you try to run a branch in Russia, because of those cultural values being inconsistent, you're going to have major difficulties motivating employees, observing their performance, correcting whatever mistakes are corrected, and the relationship between you and your subordinates will not necessarily be as effective. If you make a local guy a manager, then the relationship within that local unit would probably be great, but the relationship between the local unit and the headquarters will suffer. A better approach, actually, as funny as it sounds, is to put a third country national in charge of operations. Ideally, the guy who has lived like in the United States and in the third country, so he or she has some familiarity with cultures, but who is not perceived as strongly belonging to a specific camp by either the headquarters or the local people. So if you're an American business opening up a branch in Russia, put a French guy in charge, put an Italian guy in charge. And companies that do that tend to see better relationship, more consistent relationship forming, and that's probably the way to go. And now, the topic that I mentioned initially, this backward internationalization. So up until this point, we talked about U.S. companies expanding to the rest of the world, and how to exploit the opportunities that they find there. It turns out there is an equally active wave of backward internationalization as firms from emerging economies expanding into developed markets. There are many reasons why they do that. A big one is learning opportunities. Another big one is, these markets are stable. There's not too much risk if you operate in the United States compared to, say, Colombia. So you want to safeguard your business, you want to have a presence here. Greater market potential, right? People are well off, generally speaking, and they have sizable discretionary income. Availability of debt financing around the world, getting access to bank credit is not necessarily that easy. Whereas in the United States, it's fairly easy, even if you're an international company or an international manager of an international company. There are no insurmountable roadblocks. Sometimes it is encouraged by your investors, right? So they want you to go, so you don't really have much say. So in this case, it's not a pull internationalization; it's push international expansion. And there's also this belief that if you make it in this competitive market in the United States, if you develop a sound strategy that allows you to survive and prosper here, then definitely you're going to be able to make it in the rest of the world. So, this Chinese electronic, like home electronics manufacturer, Hire, they make those refrigerators and whatnot. They actually wanted to establish presence in the United States to be able to claim at home that they are competitive enough to carve a chunk of that market for themselves. That gives them extra legitimacy, that gives them access to that financing, that gives them visibility and PR opportunities. So sometimes companies do that just for that. And when they come here, because they have lower labor costs and because they do not have to comply with all those environmental regulations that we have in the States, uh, it's actually pretty dangerous for the US incumbents because, people ultimately, if the products are not terribly differentiated, they buy on price. So ignoring it is a poor strategy. If you ignore it, the problem is not going to go away. So how do you deal with that? It turns out there are some tips that you can try to implement as you deal with the problem. And the first one is, if you can't ignore them, and chances are you can't, you differentiate, right? You cannot compete on price alone. So don't be afraid to charge more. Emphasize the uniqueness of your product. Even if it's just US made, if that's the only part about the product that is unique, there are a lot of customers who wouldn't mind paying a bit more for a product that is made in the States by the US workers, and buying it would support local economy. You may try to engage in process improvement to make sure that your differentiated features will cost you less today than yesterday, right? So at least you can, offer some savings to your loyal customers, and that's that. You may try considering diversification into low-cost segment if and only if it offers synergies with your existing business. So you don't try all of a sudden to become the low-cost leader in the industry. But If there are opportunities to get some synergies with what you do otherwise, yeah, maybe that you may try to do that. If it's not going to help you much on the low cost side, because of those synergies, maybe the effectiveness and efficiency of your differentiated business will go up. You try to switch to selling solutions. Basically, you get the customers addicted. Rather than buying a product, they buy a solution to the problem. And this way, they stop thinking about the cost, right? They think about having the issue addressed. And as long as your costs, they don't have to be minimal, as long as they're reasonable, they're probably going to go with you. And if nothing else works, you switch to low cost models completely, but that's like declaring failure because you're not going to be able necessarily to compete with low cost entrants from those cheaper countries. The other strategy that has been shown to work fairly effectively is that you try to change the pricing of your product or your services in a way where it is no longer possible for customers to say who's the cheapest. It may sound a bit too abstract, but I'll give you an example of phone services in Australia. So in the 90s, with the development of IP and voice over IP, there were many new entrants coming from third countries into Australia, offering essentially the same service for much less. All right, so imagine like you had an AT&T that was this legacy carrier, and a bunch of new entrants who were actually legally able to use your own infrastructure to compete with you for your customers. Right? So the government tried to increase, to encourage competition. So they made it a requirement for you to share your infrastructure with those new entrants. And so historically, you've been charging this much for service per month of individual customers. And those new guys came in and they were charging maybe 30% less. So what do you do? In this case, that company, the legacy carrier in Australia, thought long and hard, and they changed their pricing model completely, where now there was this differential pricing of the phone service. For instance, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., the calls were 3 cents a minute. 8 a.m. to noon, maybe 5 cents a minute. Beyond that, I don't know, 7 cents a minute. It doesn't really matter what the prices were, and maybe like 11 p.m. through 5 a.m. free. And once they do that, it is no longer possible to say who is cheaper unless those startups, those incoming firms, adopt the same exact price and structure, which they didn't. So here we have this consumer report publication that compares similar products to say who is cheaper, who is better. They have that similar publication in Australia. People there were trying really hard to analyze who's the cheapest one, and they couldn't. So the overall conclusion for the customers were, well, it's not possible to say who's cheaper, then go with who you know best. Go with that local AT&T, the legacy carrier who you've known for decades, who you've trusted for so long. And that's how it was able to successfully resist the entry of low-cost companies from outside of the domestic market. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. And the final issue I want to touch on today is the so-called postures on the global arena that multinationals can adopt when entering third countries. And basically, again, as I said, everything in strategy is a two by two. So here we look at two dimensions. One is whether or not your intentions and your actions are strategic or tactical. And the other one is whether you come engaged with the local forces or if you're dealing with them at arm's length, trying to maintain your distance. Obviously, every 2 by 2 gives you four possible cells. So we're going to start with exploitive multinational enterprise. Those guys, they focus on maximizing short-term shareholder interest. They exploit differences in wages, legislation, living conditions, and living standards. They see them as exploitable opportunities. They take absolutely no community responsibility, and they engage in questionable practices such as bribery to obtain concessions from national governments. There are many companies that behave like that. The extent to which it is legal could be debated. It definitely has its short term benefits, and to the extent that strategic leadership of many companies now, they don't have a very long time horizon. Right, so I believe I mentioned that the average tenure of a CEO right now is under 3 years, whereas previously, we talked about decades. So as long as those people believe that in the next 2, 3 years they can get above average returns, they're probably going to adopt this exploitive posture, which for the long term is not good at all. And all those non governmental organizations that you're going to have in third countries will be your adversaries. So you probably remember that scandal many years ago with Nike and exploiting child labor somewhere in Southeast Asia. There was this famous photo of a boy, I think, like sewing together a soccer ball or something like that. It was later revealed that that photo was staged. It was not real, but the damage it caused for Nike was very, very substantial. So, if you really have the long term perspective, this is the posture you want to exploit, even if it offers short term benefits sort of immediately. So, you don't want to do that. A different approach is the transactional multinational enterprise. Here, you care about the long term shareholder interest. You try to be law abiding, you do not bribe anyone, you comply with local regulations, but you still exploit them in as much as they differ from what you have at home, right? If you have to clean your, I don't know, waste in the States to a certain standard, maybe over there you don't, so you don't. And that saves you money. Here you have to pay your laborers this much and provide benefits and whatnot. Over there you don't have to, so you don't. So your goal here is to do no harm. You maintain your distance, you do not really engage with them, and you simply use country differences to gain competitive advantage. I will try to find that article to share with you. It's called The Forgotten Strategy about arbitrage as the strategy that allows you to exploit those country differences and gain sustainable, at least temporarily sustainable competitive advantage. So if I do find that article, it's an easy read. It's not long at all, and you will actually feel glad that you've read it. In this case, those non-governmental organizations that previously were your adversaries, now they are watchdogs. They watch for you to make a mistake so they can attack you, so they still not your friends. The third posture is the responsive multinational enterprise. Here, you focus on maximizing shareholder value. You actually look beyond shareholders. You also look at immediate stakeholder. You try to maximize their interests as well. And you do that by contributing to the environment where you operate. So rather than pay this meager, low wage that is established in the third country, you actually pay those people more. You create better working conditions uh, than are required by the local government. You try to conform to higher standards. You're not trying to change the world. You're not trying to change the country, but you treat your people better than the market requires, and that definitely creates long-term value for you and for them. So that is a much better strategic approach. Non-governmental organizations here, they're not even watchdogs. They definitely not your enemies. So they act as observers. They try to learn from you. They try to help you share your practices with other multinational enterprises. So, but here they start becoming your partner. You can lean on them to spread the word. You can use their expertise to, for successful PR activities and whatnot. So this gives you an opportunity to create value by leveraging the assets that you don't even own. So that's a helpful one. And then the final posture, the so-called transformative multinational enterprise. So here you actually try to focus on maximizing stakeholders' interest and developing broader society. So rather than just treating your workers better than is required by the local regulations, you actually try to change the way employees are treated in that country, right? You try to lift people out of poverty. You try to provide them with training. You open maybe trade schools and whatnot. You work with governments and third organizations to effectively create a new market for yourself and for others by contributing you know to bettering people's lives. So you raise local standards, you are proactive. In this case, those non-governmental organizations are truly your partners. They help you out. They spread the word, and if you manage to harness that, then even though it costs you more in the short run, in the long run, it does create a lot of value for you and for your shareholders. And with that, I will stop. So there's still a lot we have to do this week, right? There's a quiz, there's an exam, there's a group project. So lots and lots of grading for me later on this week. I will also ask you to provide me with a formal feedback. So check your D2L. There will be a link to a survey, and I may request a few other things as well. I am available this week if you need any consultation or want to discuss any of your submissions, projects, quizzes, exams. Yeah, let's schedule the conversation. And otherwise, guys, I want to thank you for a good semester. It's been definitely interesting for me. Uh, I hope that you've learned something that you will be able to use for your own careers, and wishing you the best.